Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Reggie, and thank you, everyone that came out. It's an honor to be part of this program, The Rebellious Misbreed. Before we get started, a little bit about me. I'm a native San Diegan, and I've spent the last 20 years enlisted in the military here. And I'm of Italian-American heritage, and this is October, and we're in California, and so this is actually Italian-American Heritage Month. So I'm going to talk a little bit about things like executive orders, enemy aliens, detainment camps, things like that. And I'm going to be talking about things that impacted the entire country, but we're just going to look at it from the Italian lens. This is my book, as I said, The Fight Abroad and the Fear Back Home. It's really two books in one. One looks at the contribution of Italian Americans during the war, land, air, sea, and on the home front. And I worked with two gentlemen in their 90s who served on that. It was an honor. And the other half of the book looks at the treatment of the Italians, their relatives and loved ones on predominantly the West Coast. And these are some of the areas I'm going to cover, and that's all encompassed in my book. Here's some other sources that are out there I'm going to talk about that were an inspiration for me, but really the spark that ignited it for me was my grandmother, Jack Niotta, who's no longer with us. But during all of my interviews, my talks with folks about the war years, she talked about a fear that was there that resonated among an entire people throughout the country. And so we're going to talk about that. And really, honestly, I didn't know how legitimate or how her fear, how it was actually legitimate. You know, she was 15 years old. Sometimes young people can dramatize things. But really, in my research, I came to find out that it was a legitimate fear. We're going to talk about that today. So I like timelines. Timelines are great. You look at the events, what happened in past. They're in a synchronized order, right? It tells a story. You know that game Scrabble? You got a bunch of letters. You spell a word. Well, if you move around those letters, it spells a different word. It tells a different story. So we're going to try and keep things actually in a sequential order. That way nothing gets skipped over. So in 1978, there was a man named Jerry Mangione who released a book. And basically, he was the PR person for Attorney General Francis Biddle. So he was working on the pamphlets that went out to some of the enemy alien individuals to kind of help ease them in with all these restrictive directives that were coming down. And what's interesting about his book is it talks about the different organizations, the governmental organizations that were involved, and you can see that they didn't really see eye to eye. They argued. So you have that component, but what's probably more special about this book is part of his job brought him out to all of the different detainment centers throughout the country. So, and he reports about that in his book. He writes about the demographics, the conditions, what they wore, what they ate. So it's a great contribution, came out in 1978. And then the late 80s, you had Dr. Stephen Fox. So he was a history teacher in a university. One of his students asked, hey, is it true that the Germans and the Italians got pushed away from the coast like the Japanese did? And the question was really a catalyst for him because here he is, a SME on World War II. He's a historian, and he's teaching the youth and the young adults about this, and he doesn't know anything about it. So that really got him on a quest to research the topic, and he tracked down a lot of people who were impacted and conducted extensive interviews. And that came out in a book in 1990 known as The Unknown Internment, later retitled Uncivil Liberties. And it was influential for other individuals moving forward. Also around that timeline, there were organizations that were looking to have some kind of acknowledgement for the Japanese from the government, a formal apology. And we ended up with, I think, 2 for the Japanese from presidents, U.S. presidents, reparation payments. And so basically OSIA around this time, which is the oldest Italian-American group in America, they're still around. I'm actually doing a program like this for them next month in their Maryland chapter. They pretty much were looking for the same consideration for the Italians. We just want this to be put in the history books. We just want a formal apology. And unfortunately, the DOJ said, no, based on the fact that, according to their records, only 228 Italians had been interned, which is inaccurate, and we'll go over that. So moving forward, in 1994, there was an exhibit very much like the Rebellious Miss Breed that popped up in San Francisco. And it had drawings, vignettes, artwork, stories, and letters, kind of looking at the Italian perspective. And it really actually took off, and it ended up traveling the United States for the next 6 years. It appeared in more than 20 cities, major cities, and it gained considerable attention. In 97, you started to see some movement. There was several bills that were enacted in order to declassify some of these documents, federal documents, covering what happened with wartime internment. And then lobbying forward to the end of the decade, the House of Representatives passes this act. And all that really does was call for this year-long investigation. And they poured through the FBI files they had sitting in facilities all across the country and in Washington, more than 1,000 boxes of classified paperwork. And they also, what they did is they called in the survivors, people who are in their 90s, people who are younger, who were small children during this time, and they had them testify. They interviewed them on several occasions. Some people they brought back more than once. You can see some of the news coverage that's coming out. New York Times, 1997, the Italians are looking for an apology. 2001, scholarly peer-reviewed journals are starting to look at this because now we have this act out and they're actually going through the files. As you can see in this journal, it came out saying that it was the plan from the start of the War Department to intern all enemy aliens. And we'll get into why that didn't happen. So moving forward with our timeline, 2001, Dr. DeStassi, he's the one that coordinated that program, that exhibit that was in the Bay Area and had been traveling throughout the country. He finally captured it in a book that was a collection of essays. Do you mind holding the questions for a little bit, please? He captured it in a book that has scholarly essays. It also has first person, like vignettes and such, and some artwork and photos. And later that year, that investigation, right, the year-long investigation, they published a report. And it's about 250 pages long. And it just covers the tangible, the things they could actually prove based on the records they were able to find throughout the country in this year-long investigation. And unfortunately, no one cared about the document when it was published. No one cared because it was released less than 2 months after the attack on the Twin Towers. So no one cared about injustices that occurred 50 plus years ago because a bunch of Americans were just killed, terrorism on our own soil. No one cared because we were about ready to go into war. And I know that because I raised my hand 2 weeks before September 11th happened, and I served overseas in Iraq. And I knew nothing about this. And I'm an Italian American, and I'm a historian. I knew nothing about this at that time. So moving forward, 2009, California finally designates, they finally recognize this happened. They designate October, it's not arbitrary, very purposely, October for Italian American Heritage Month. And that next year, the Italians finally got what they were after, a formal apology. Deepest regrets of these acts, a fundamental injustice. And here's just a snippet I have from that document with the formal apology. So we are recording this. I would recommend that if you don't get a chance to look at the full document, because I have a lot of snippets in here, I'm not going to have time to read everything on there. Go back and check out the presentation later. Okay, so now let's look at the timeline of what happened actually after the bombing on December 7th, right? So mere hours after that, you had Proclamation 2525 signed, and that means the U.S. declares war on Japan, and you have this big roundup that happened hours after that. And that very next morning, some folks don't know, they signed 2 more proclamations, 26 and 27, and that designated Germans and Italians enemy aliens as well. We declared war on those countries also. So actually, I'm going to read something from my book here regarding that. Death on American soil flipped a switch, signaling a green light for federal attack. Long rehearsed, the moves came quick. Mere hours after the attack, the president gave federal operatives all the authority they needed. Door to door they moved, rounding up suspects. From the start, it was very clear that the Japanese were not the only target. Agents snapped Doris Gelada's father and shipped him off to an internment camp. They came after Anita Parada's husband, too, and as they marched him off to a detention facility, her home was ransacked by the FBI. None were charged with the crime. They were not even told why they were being taken. Filippo Molinari wrote about his experience in a letter he sent home from an internment camp in Montana. At 11 p.m., 3 policemen came to my front door and 2 to the back. They told me that by order of President Roosevelt, I must go with them. They didn't give me time to go to my room and put on my shoes. Wearing slippers, Felipe Molinari rode a train from California to Montana through snow and temperatures of 17 degrees and below. They refused to let him grab his coat. The confused passengers aboard these trains were never told their destination, and those in charge took steps to ensure their new prisoners remained in the dark. All the windows aboard the train were blacked out. For the children and the spouses who had just witnessed a father or husband being taken away by government officials in the middle of the night, the anxious fear would not soon be sated. Families who had witnessed the arrests were confounded by the unfolding events as to the fate of their spouses, and particularly their own financial solvency, since detainees' assets had been frozen. And these are just some more snippets that kind of shows what I've been talking about here. So Felipe Molinari's experience, 25, 26, and 27. Now this is definitely, like I said, not all-encompassing, but from the records during that year-long search, these are some of the names of the Italians that they found in that first few days in that first initial roundup. And you can see number 46 is Mr. Filippo Molinari. Okay, so now we're looking at all the individuals who didn't get taken in that initial roundup, right? So in mid-December, they had confiscation of the enemy alien boats. Now in LA, this really hit the Japanese fishing communities, Terminal Island, San Pedro, right? Heavily populated Japanese into that industry in LA. Now you go to the northern part of the state, it's all Italian. And I'll show you a slide that looks at some of the numbers. But soon all of them were actually barred from commercial fishing altogether. So their livelihood was taken from them. And they were barred from the sea. So some of them moved over to the canning industry. But shortly after that, it was deemed that enemy aliens could not work in any food processing plants. So they were out of job there as well. Later that same month, we had a call saying that individuals must turn in what they were calling contraband. Now some of this made sense, right? Ammo, guns, knives, weapons. But there were some other things that were kind of a little different. You had shortwave radios. And the premise of that was that potentially you could signal the enemy, right? Cameras. You could potentially take reconnaissance photos. Later, they were taking maps and flashlights. Flashlights because if you lived along the coast, you could potentially signal at night an enemy plane or any ship or sub. That was the premise behind that. This was not well implemented. So all the individuals, Italians, Germans, and Japanese that turned this stuff in, there was no infrastructure set up with the local authorities who were tasked with this. Most of the people who turned this stuff in never got it back. We're talking about family heirlooms and such as well. So, looking at the beginning of the new year, Proclamation 2537 rolls in, right? So, enemy aliens age 14 and older, this is some 1.1 million, were forced to register, right? So, these individuals, that's 1.1 million. Now, to try and make this as less threatening, as least threatening as possible, they didn't want to bring these folks into police stations. They decided post offices would be less menacing, a place that they go to on the regular. So basically what they did is they brought folks in and they were all photographed. You can see here's an actual one from the time there. Photographed, fingerprinted, all of their information, where they worked, where they lived, their physical features. It's pretty much the same as a passport. Anytime they moved, they had to update this information. Anytime that they were out side of their home if they got stopped. If they didn't have this on them, they were subject to internment for the duration of the war. And the outer covering was pink. They called it the Pink Book. Okay. So later that month, California Governor Olson said, let's revoke all of their professional licenses. So if you're a lawyer, you can no longer practice law. If you own a bar or a liquor store, you can no longer sell alcohol. You know, if you were a licensed fisherman, well, it didn't really matter because you weren't allowed to go to the sea anyway. And then at the very close of January of that year, they started mentioning, oh, by the way, we've designated some areas, and if you are an enemy alien and you live or work in that area, you need to move. So there were restricted areas and forbidden areas. And I'll get into that in a minute here, but imagine this. You live, this is late January, and people have a little more than 2 weeks to move from their family home. So if you own a house, you either have to find someone to rent it or sell it in 2 weeks, pack up everything you own, and find a new place to live, or you have to board it up and hope that no one vandalizes it, burns it down, squats in it in the meantime. Same if you own a business. You got to find someone to run your business, or you got to close up shop. Imagine that. Now also imagine that you have to find a new place to live further out. The President of the United States has just dubbed you an enemy. Do you think anyone's going to rent to you? And here we have a snippet that lists all of the ports where, it says at times, but any enemy alien was forbidden to go to any of these ports to fish. And this picture here, I think it was in January of '42. Those are all Italian boats in the Fisherman's Wharf in the Bay Area there that were moored for weeks already. And yeah, there's a little bit of information on here with some numbers. Again, these are the tangibles. These are the ones they actually had names for. So it's not all encompassing, and I think the numbers are very light. As it says there, Italian Americans, right, they really dominated that industry in the northern end of the state. So 1,400 Italian American fishermen in San Francisco alone, right? You also had Santa Cruz and other areas up there. All right, so we talked about some of those zones. So in early February, they did this thin layer right here, right? And this is actually in the newspapers. This is what folks saw early March. As you can see, they've grown considerably, and they continued to grow. And at one point, this went from Canada to Mexico. 7 states that were impacted with this. So curfew and travel restrictions were announced. Soon those would go into effect. And just before Valentine's Day, happy Valentine's Day, people were running around places like LA and tacking up signs. The Boy Scouts were enlisted in some areas to do this. And these signs were in English. These signs were in Japanese, German, and Italian. And they said, hey, you need to get out by this date. Now, there was not a letter that came in the mail. There wasn't a knock on the door that let these people know this. There were just some signs in the neighborhood. It might have been in the newspapers, so if they could read about it. It might have been on the radio, so if they still had a radio, maybe they could listen to that. Interesting enough about the radio, sidebar, my great uncle, he's in his 90s, still around. He lived in Boyle Heights at the time. Came back from high school one day, came and he learned from his parents that his neighbors, some federal agents showed up, went through the house, no warrants, went through the house, took pieces from the radio and took them with them because they thought maybe they could use that. That neighbor just so happened to be his grandparents. And they were so advanced in age that they actually, I don't think they lived through the war years. So now we go to February 19th, Executive Order 9066. And I think a lot of people, when they think about what happens, they go right from the attack to Executive Order 9066 to the exodus of Japanese. And you're missing a lot of things that happen in between and some preemptive measures. And I'm going to talk about that as well. And really all that did is it gave the Army, the War Department, control over all the other governmental branches to get in line with their objective. And it also gave them the ability to intern whoever the hell they wanted for whatever reason they wanted, citizen or not. If they felt you were a threat, they could intern you, right? And you couldn't have legal representation. And naturally, this is going to get a lot of organizations really riled up. So you had protests, ACLU and other groups were involved. The end of that month, you had that second relocation went into effect, and the travel and curfew restrictions were now in effect. So if you weren't going to and from work, you could not travel more than 5 miles from your home, right? If you worked at night, you had to find a new job, because at 8 o'clock you had to be in your house, and you had to stay there until about 6 in the morning. Here's some personal recollections from it. About 2,000 Italians were forced to move from Pittsburgh in Northern California, right? The Army set up shop there, and all the Italians in that neighborhood had to move. Joe Aiello was a resident for 56 years, but he wasn't an American citizen yet. He hadn't naturalized. So they forced him out of his home in his wheelchair. Placebo Albano was 97. They pulled him out in a stretcher. These are just a couple examples. If you read the resources, the primary resources that I put up there, lots of examples like these. Rosina Trovato, I mean, imagine this here. She learned that she had to move out of her residence in Monterey the same day she found out that her son and I think it was her nephew were killed during the attack on Pearl Harbor. The ultimate smack in the face. So there was a program of selective internment for the Italians, and I'll get into that. Here's a couple of examples where they actually did intern some naturalized citizens. You had Nino Guttadaro, who was a business manager of the Fishermen's Association in San Francisco. He had to move away from the water. He ended up resituating in Reno. You had Ettore Patrizini, who was in his 70s, and he was affiliated with a very prominent Italian newspaper. They wanted him to move. He was actually in the hospital. He naturalized in 1898. In 1942, they came to him in the hospital and said, hey, you need to move. So as soon as he got out of that hospital, he relocated. Silvestro Andriano, he was an attorney, and he was also a former member of the city's police commission and board of supervisors. He also got exclusion orders, so he had to move. Going into early March, so a lot of people don't know about this, but General DeWitt, he was in charge of the 7th Army. He was basically head of the War Department there and the initiatives. He went down to Mexico and to ensure he had buy-in. And there were about a dozen or so Latin American countries that he convinced to purge or intern all of their enemy aliens. As soon as they stepped across the border into America, we went, okay, we're interning you. And then the Japanese exodus happened. So everything I've talked about has happened before the Japanese exodus. So there's a lot of things that happen that folks seem to glance over. Now here's the rest of the plan. This, while they were beginning to roll out the efforts for the mass exodus of Japanese, this is what was printed in the newspapers. The plan was for the Italians and the Germans to be next in waves. They designated different areas. And here's some snippets from that 2001 report talking about it, saying this was the plan from the get-go, even after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So let's talk about why it didn't happen. And really it was feasibility. So at that time, the largest ethnic community in America were the Italians. There were about 5 million of us in America at that point. And we were the largest ethnic force fighting in World War II on the side of the U.S. There were about 500,000 of us fighting, right? And we were dispersed in industries throughout the country. The second largest ethnic population in America at that time was the Germans. It was not feasible. There was no way that they could do this. So what they had to do was a selective internment program, right? Where they tried to pick individuals that they felt needed to be moved away from the coast or put in an internment camp. And these weren't criminals. These were pretty much the best and the brightest, and I'll talk about that. And I have Hawaii on there because that's an example of where the demographics were the other way around. You had a huge, huge Japanese population in Hawaii and hardly any Italians or Germans. And for that reason, they could not intern the Japanese en masse because they didn't have the infrastructure for it, and it would have crippled many industries there. So I've got a couple pieces that I'd like to read regarding that. Dear Mr. President, last night I listened to the I'm an American broadcast sitting in a primitive barrack in an internment camp, and I could not help feeling sadly disillusioned. I had come to America as a poor young boy, 13 years old, and had lived in the country ever since. In 1918, I became an American citizen and served with the American Expeditionary Force in France. I received an honorable discharge. I then married and now have a son, 17, and a daughter, 21, both born Americans. My son will join the armed forces soon, and my daughter is to be married this summer to a man wearing the U.S. Army uniform. I've always lived an honorable family life and am a businessman, head of the contracting establishment which I have created, of excellent standing. Still, here I am in a prisoner's camp, forced to live in close contact with people whose countries are at war with mine. I received the worst shock in my life when, on December 8th, 1941, I was arrested in my home in Honolulu, torn away from my family, brought to the mainland under incredible conditions, and finally interned here 5,000 miles from my home. In Honolulu, I was given a so-called hearing which lasted 5 minutes. No formal accusation against which I could have defended myself was ever brought against me, nor were the reasons for my arrest ever disclosed to me. There were 12 other naturalized American citizens in my company and subjected to the same odyssey. Now, I have his son's recollection of that event as well. Dad and I were working on the exterior balcony to his bedroom the afternoon of December 8th, 1942. This was the same place we were when we saw the Japanese planes attack in the morning before. The Star-Spangled Banner came on over our radio, and Dad had us both stand at attention and sing. A while later, a car came down our entry road and into the parking yard. 2 men in suits and ties, rare on Monday in the country, got out and asked Dad if he was Mario Valdestri. When Dad said yes, the men said, "Will you please come with us?" My father asked if he could change, but the men told him to come as he was dressed. Dad, however, took off his sweaty t-shirt and put on a sweatshirt. He said to my mother that they probably needed him as an interpreter, and they left in the FBI agent's car. Later, my dad informed me that many Italians, Germans, and other Caucasian men and women, not Japanese, were taken to a large barred room upstairs in the immigration building. They were there for many hours, with no chairs, furniture, or toilet facilities. After some time, the people behind the bars began to protest loudly, and a soldier with a rifle guarding them said, "Shut up, you goddamn spies." Sometime in February 1942, he was shipped to the mainland United States with only the Hawaiian clothes he had. He tried to keep warm by putting newspapers under his clothing. Eventually, he arrived at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, where he was reasonably well treated. Okay. Let's see what else I have here. All right, so let's get back to our timeline. Late June, General DeWitt allows several thousand Italians. Basically, he eased up some of these restrictions. Something has changed. The Japanese have been moved out, and he balks on this plan to move out the Germans and Italians. And now they're easing up things. What's going on? Basically, they needed to bring some of the Italians and Germans back to work in the agricultural and different industries to help with the war effort. And then on October 12th, 1942, Columbus Day, you have Attorney General Francis Biddle. He comes up there, and he's at the pulpit in Carnegie Hall. He's on the radio, and he tries to convince the American people, oh, the Italians, we can trust them. They've proved themselves. Only 228 of the thousands of them had to be interned. We're going to go ahead and we're going to take them off the enemy alien list. So anyone who was already interned remained there until after the war. But come the 19th, Italians came off the enemy alien list. And then later, a couple months later, the Germans, just before Christmas, were taken off the list. So the Japanese they'd already been sent out en masse. There was no taking them off the list because everyone who was taken off the list still remained interned until after the war. There was no takebacks on that. January 2nd, 1945, the Japanese surrender happens. My great uncle was there for that. I worked with him on the book. At that point, anyone who was Japanese that was interned stateside was allowed to return home, but many of them were reluctant to do so, and so they stayed longer. September 2nd, 1945, the war officially ended, and the remaining internment camps were closed down. I have an excerpt from my book I'd like to read as well. When it finally came time to empty the remaining detainment facilities still harboring enemy aliens, the Japanese had already been released. In a silent effort to avoid national attention, signs were posted at the internment camp post offices announcing the release of all internees. Campbell, California business owner John Parada took a streetcar home from an INS detention facility in Sharp Park. Recalling the event, his wife indicated he was too embarrassed to have us take him home. He was not the only one that felt this way. While returning to their homes and families must have been a relief, it also brought a new source of anxiety and embarrassment. Re-entering their old communities and facing their neighbors that had, and perhaps still did, view them as enemies, inmates, and traitors. Okay, so a lot of folks seem to think this was all reactionary, right? The attack on American soil, and then all this suddenly happened. Well, there was about 2.5, 3 years of legwork behind it. In the summer of 1939, the president tasked the FBI with keeping tabs on folks, right? They came up with these threat groups, A, B, and C. And these weren't criminals. These were people who had a pulpit, people who were involved with organizations, newspapers, consulates, language schools. June of 1940, before we have our first time peacetime draft in America, they had the Alien Registration Act, the Smith Act. So all non-citizens throughout America, as you imagine, that's a lot of people, had to go to these post office and register. And that there was no photos taken with that. I've got one of them right here, actually. Thumbprints. You were given a number, and you had to have that on you at all times. And then the end of March 1941, the president said, okay, any ships for belonging to Axis nations, we're going to go ahead and seize those. We weren't involved in the fight in World War II yet. We weren't involved. But they went ahead and they seized about 68, I think, vessels. And nearly 30 of them were Italian vessels, including this cruise ship that was stuck in the Panama Canal there, the Il Conti. Right? Most of these were fishing vessels. Right? And then you think about supply and demand, right? March 31st, we got these people, we got to do something with them. April, that very next month, Fort Missoula, which was used during World War I, was readied for internment. And I tell you right now, Fort Missoula, when that initial roundup happened, I think they sent 1,000 prominent Japanese there right off the bat. And it is now a museum. And they have a website with some numbers, and they actually house an equal number of Japanese and Italians there. It was more than 1,000 of each of them. As you can see here, I've showed you these already, the live ones, but this photo here is, I think that's in New York, in a post office, kind of the madness. The lines were outside the building and 2-3 blocks down, if you can imagine. Don't leave home without it, because as I said, if you didn't have this pink book with you, you were subject to internment for the duration of the war. Right? So May 1941, you have 125 Italian citizens that were sent to Fort Missoula. These were people who were at the World's Fair in New York. 70 of them were brought from Italy to serve as waiters. They got interned. You had the crew of the Il Conti, where a lot of them were actually entertainers. They were sent there. Right? And they joined all those fishermen that got seized up, the crews of the fishing boats. In the summer of 1941, Francis Biddle, he instructed Edward Ennis, he was the head of the DOJ's Alien Enemy Control Unit, to get more facilities ready, right? Pearl Harbor is still intact. We're not at war. We're already interning people. This is a picture of Fort Missoula. Like I said, they have a website. That description is from their website. I would encourage you to check out their website. At one point, I would like to go and actually go to the museum and see it. All right, so the stats vary. I'm not going to read all this, but as I said, Columbus Day, which was a very important day to the Italians, not a popular holiday now, but it was chosen as a day to tell Italians to be taken off the list because it was an important day. It was a propaganda move. And he said, oh, only 228 of them were interned. if you look at the findings from the year-long investigation, and this is just the tangibles that they found records of, you can see roughly 50,000 were hit by the curfew laws. These are just the Italians we're talking about. More than 10,000 West Coast Italians forced out of their homes and kept from the coast. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds sent off to military camps for internment. And we already know that that's inaccurate because the website in Fort Missoula said they had more than 1,000 Italians. So these are a list of the names, numbers for the names they physically have. I showed you a few of them already. Nearly 2,000 Italians taken into custody. They had their names, right? So others were conducting research as well. Tetsuren Kashima, he interviewed a lot of the high-ranking officials in the DOJ. He had some numbers, and he listed them. He had counted 2,730 Italian citizens arrested and interned. But Immigration and Naturalization Service records, and that was also including all those enemy aliens that got deported in, right, that push in from Latin America. And they said they processed 3,278 Italians. So the stats vary depending upon who you ask. But if anyone tells you, oh, there was only 200 Italians, that's not true. Here are some of the camps that we know based on the paperwork that Italians were kept, and also from Jerry Mangione's book, because he went throughout the country to all these facilities, right? And we know mostly about their conditions there from Jerry's book and from the letters that they sent back. So here's some of the lasting impacts, right? A loss of language, identity, customs, over-Americanization. Assistant DA John B. Molinari said back in the late 80s, after the war, basically the Italian communities just evaporated. They were diffused and began to disintegrate. So you had all these newspapers throughout the country that were shut down during the war, all these clubs, and most of them never reopened. Looks like I have a couple more excerpts I was going to read. And we're coming on that 40-minute marker. I don't know how I am for time, Linda, if we want to. Okay. All right. Almost overnight, hundreds of teachers, newspaper editors, writers, and club leaders disappeared. Giovanni Falasca, editor of the LA-based Italian paper La Parola, was among them. After a dark train ride, he spent the duration of the war at Fort Missoula. From what we can see, the only crime these individuals were guilty of was being Italian and serving as prominent members within their culture enclaves. And yet they were singled out and treated like traitors and enemies. A wave of shame, guilt, shock, and fear fell over those who witnessed these incidents. It must have been shocking. Their moral leaders, those admired, considered the best, brightest, and most wholesome among them, were snatched up like common criminals. Following this, to even speak their own language became a crime. I do have a couple more pieces that I would like to read, if that's okay with you, Linda. This is from Dr. DeStassi's book that he edited. So this is scholarly essays and vignettes, first person. When orders came for my mother to leave Monterey, I went with my parents to look for a house in Salinas. When we would ask for a place to live, they would ask why we had to move. We told them, and they said, Italians from Monterey? You're aliens? We're not renting to you. I felt devastated. I would say, I'm an American citizen. My father's an American citizen. My father would say, keep quiet. But how could they hurt my mother like this? She was crying all the time. When we were getting ready to move to Salinas, there were moving vans all over the neighborhood, and all the women were crying. I think I might have one or two more pieces. Here's another first person of a son. On a quiet evening in late February of 1942, my great-grandmother was greeted at the doorstep of her clapboard home in the coastal community of Santa Cruz by two agents of the Department of Justice. She spoke little English, while the federal agents spoke no Italian, much less a Genoese dialect that was the common tongue of the Santa Cruz Italian fishing colony. A granddaughter who lived next door was summoned to serve as a translator. My great-grandmother was told she was in violation of a recently passed federal law. The agents informed her that she had 48 hours to move herself and her belongings inland of Highway 1, or she would be subject to immediate arrest. A few weeks earlier, my great-grandmother had registered with the Alien Registration Division. Standing all of 4 foot, 10 inches, and weighing 140 pounds, my great-grandmother could hardly have been a threat to the U.S. war effort against the Axis powers. 2 of her sons and 2 of her grandsons, not to mention several nephews and cousins, had recently enlisted in the U.S. Navy. She had lived on the same plot of land for a little more than 41 years and rarely ventured more than a few blocks off. Those are all the pieces that I was going to read, Linda. Don't really have anything else. If you have any questions or whatnot, I'm here. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm really glad to hear that they're going to have that panel on the 27th, because I thought I was the only one that was going to be talking about the Italian enemy alien situation. So I will definitely be here for that.
Was it Missoula, you said, where there were Japanese Americans and the Italian Americans together?
Yes, Fort Missoula, Montana. It was up in the mountains, and they probably had it a little better than most. I mean, it was remote, but they had all those entertainers, right? They got sent there in 1939.
Was that common to have both groups together?
So it was different. Every single detainment facility throughout the country was run by a different organization, so it was night and day. Some places you went, they were wearing regular clothes. Sometimes they were wearing basically the POW jumpsuits. Sometimes they grew their own food. Sometimes they were allowed to leave to go work in the neighborhood, as POWs were as well. I know in some instances POWs were allowed to get signed out. This is not enemy aliens. These are actual military POWs. We're allowed to get signed out by a sponsor and taken to a dance or a dinner and then brought back to the facilities. So POWs actually had more rights than a lot of these individuals. But because of Geneva Convention laws and whatnot, they tried to keep the facilities up to par because, right, our captured individuals overseas would be treated the same, ideally. And the whole premise with them deporting those individuals into our borders was to use them as bartering power to trade for American soldiers. So.
You guys have any questions?
Yes, sir.
Is there any difference between the 2 coasts in the treatment of Italians and, for that matter, Japanese? But I'm especially curious about the Italians.
Well, certainly he was asking if there was any difference between the 2 coasts. And also about the Italians and the Japanese as far as their treatment. Well, they were anticipating another attack would happen in America along the coast, and for whatever reason, specifically California in that area. And they had, talking about the treatment of the Italians versus the treatment of the Japanese, really why this happened to the Japanese en masse and not the Italians, because up until the Exodus, they were all subject to the same treatment. Obviously, racism was a big factor, and the Italians and Germans could blend in a little bit more just because of the way they looked.
But I'm more interested in the difference between the 2 coasts.
Well, for whatever reason, they felt the threat, the next attack was going to be happening on California. So these things were happening in New York. They were happening in the ports. So New Orleans, Boston, New York, and then also in the Bay Area and Los Angeles. So those were the big, heavy areas. So most of the numbers that are in that document from 2001 and in the books look at those areas. Because the real goal was to push all these people into the interior. So if they were already into the interior, they'd already met that objective. Yeah. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I know that Japanese culture is shameful to talk about certain things, so the internment wasn't known and wasn't put in the books, but that's not part of Italian culture. I can't believe that Italians that were interned didn't come back and talk about it. It's not at all cultural not to.
Actually, it is. So when this happened, what happened, and I had that on my last slide. Let's see if I can go back here. There we go. There was an Americanization that happened. So you read through these first-person accounts from like Sons and the actual individuals that went through this, and Yankee Doodle became the new favorite song. They abandoned a lot of their customs. They stopped teaching, they stopped speaking their own language in the home. That way their children wouldn't go and speak it at school and go through the same thing they did. They didn't talk about it because they didn't want a repeat of what happened. They didn't talk about it at all. And I actually, in my interviews, came across this realization. I actually physically saw it on someone's face when I was interviewing them. They were a child during all of this. And I started talking to them about the different ordinances that hit their parents. They were very little. And they had this doubt, like, no way, you're crazy. I talked to my dad all the time. He would tell me about this. I would have known about this. And the reality is they didn't talk about it. They wanted it to be forgotten. They wanted to move past it. They didn't want a repeat of it. And the more I began talking to her about the different ordinances that happened and what the people did in response, I saw in her face the light coming on. She went, that's why Mom did this. That's why we stopped doing that. So really, it was similar to the Japanese where you didn't talk about it, and it was a shameful thing. Like I said, these weren't the criminals that were taken. These were the best and brightest. So this was a very difficult thing to talk about.
What about the church?
You had, and I had to trim down my slides, but I had some information in there about that as well. You had letters pouring into the president, to the churches, this, that, and the other, pleading, like, I've got X amount of kids involved that are in the military. I've lived here 50 years, this, that, and the other. I haven't naturalized because I don't know the language. I can't read in Italian, let alone English, to pass the proficiency exam. So,
No, I meant, did the church say anything in defense of the Italians?
there were a lot of groups. You had individuals like Miss Breed. There were a lot of actual rallies and protests and whatnot that happened, but ultimately the War Department, they had the final say in everything. With Executive Order 9066, they can intern anyone they want. So if they felt you were being a threat, they could intern you for your efforts.
Italian priests?
Not that I'm aware of. Not that I'm aware of. I wouldn't put it past Lieutenant General DeWitt. He was kind of a zealot. And even the other, and Jerry Mangione's book talks about the DOJ was involved, and Francis Biddle and him were back and forth night and day fighting all of the time and trying to get the president's ear. And really the president's wife intervened at one point and kind of influenced him, I think, as well. So I know that doesn't really answer your question. I don't have an answer as far as a definitive answer or an example for you for that, unfortunately.
What about your family, your personal family? Do you know anything?
So interestingly enough, on Columbus Day, they went ahead and announced the Italians are going to be taken off the enemy alien list on the 19th. My grandfather, who was a war hero, he was a ball turret gunner on a B-17, and I cover that in my book. It was the worst job in the sky in the war. He enlisted the very next day after the Italians were taken off the list. So yes, there was an impact on my family in that regard, and that's one of the reasons I actually joined, and I've been in for 20 years now, just signed up for another 2. But I don't speak Italian. My father doesn't speak Italian. My grandmother did. Her parents did. There's definitely that loss there. There are still some clubs that are around. Osia's still around, and I know that my grandmother was involved. She was one of the first presidents of the Italian American Civic Club here in San Diego, the Women's Auxiliary. She was one of the individuals that started that club. So we were definitely involved in politics in the community, in Italian American community, as a result of this, trying to be advocates.
Before we forget, maybe for the people that might be watching at home or watching in the future, where would they get your book? How do they go about writing?
So if you want to get a signed copy, there's my website. I'm going to be posting some information about this. I've got 4 books out, 3 books out right now. I'm waiting on contracts for my 4th, but this book right here is 2 books in one, and the first part really looks at what the enemy aliens throughout California and basically mostly the West Coast dealt with So if you want a signed copy, just go to my website. So, and I have some here if anyone is interested in a copy as well. So,
Any more questions or comments?
yes, sir.
As a military person, and the importance that we place on the U.S. Constitution, how do you qualify the fact that at the very moment the Constitution needs to be enforced, that it completely becomes non-existent during times of war? And can you answer it in terms of being a military person?
I would say, as being a 20-year enlisted military member, I have not had a modern political view in 2 decades. I don't speak to current affairs. I really can't speak to that. In regards to it being implemented then, they felt like it was necessary.
And would you say it was more a thing of propaganda? I mean, as far as we're in time of war, the average citizen needs to see we're doing some sort of action, we're taking action, and therefore let's do this as one of the forms of telling our population, we've got this handled, we're working on it, we're dealing with the enemies. Just to call people enemies simply because of their heritage, I mean, it's just...
Well, this happened in World War I as well.
No, I know.
With the Germans here stateside, we had internment camps.
From the beginning,
Yeah.
when we had the war with the British,
Mhm.
1814, same thing happened, but time and time again it happens. I mean, John Adams became so, people were like, why did they do the Sedition Act? And it was pretty much the same thing.
The best that I can answer is that, the people who are running the show try and do what they feel is the best for the people at that time. I do know that at that time, at the start of the war, we were in a depression, and the war actually brought us out of the depression. So it's difficult to look at the past with removing your current views and ideas and norms and cultural kind of outlooks on
The ironic
things.
thing is that those ideals are constantly repeated time and time again.
It's true.
So it's not really even a problem.
And that's why we have programs like this and people like me here talking about it, so that at least there's awareness.
Yeah.
So,
Well, thank you very much for coming. This has been really enlightening.
thank you,
I've
Linda. I
enjoyed
appreciate it.
And
Thank you.
and so on behalf of the Friends
Oh.
of the Central Library, want to give you this plaque here.
Oh, thank you.
It says Author of the Month, October 9th. San Diego Central Library is proud to recognize J. Michael.
They're
J. Michael
excited.
Brown, yeah, PhD, as an outstanding author for his new book, The Flight Abroad and the Fear Back Home.
Thank you, Linda. I
Yeah,
really
thank
appreciate
you.
that.
Yeah, thanks
Thank you
for
so
coming. It was
much.
really good.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, everyone, for coming.